Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Sorites paradox. A single grain of sand is not a heap, this much seems certain. And adding one grain of sand to something that is not a heap does not suddenly create a heap. One grain cannot make that much difference, and yet if you continue adding grains one by one, at some point you will have a heap, perhaps after 1,000 grains, perhaps 10,000, but surely 1,000,000 grains of sand piled together constitute a heap. And so somewhere in the process of adding individual grains, a heap must have come into existence, but where, after which grain? And this is the Sorites paradox, named from the Greek word for heap, a puzzle about vague predicates and the boundaries of concepts that has troubled philosophers since ancient times. The paradox can be constructed for almost any vague term. A man with a full head of hair is not bald, and removing one hair does not make a bald man. One hair cannot be the difference between bald and not bald, and yet removing hairs one by one will eventually result in baldness. Or consider a tall person. If someone is tall, then removing 1 millimeter from their height does not make them not tall. 1 millimeter is imperceptible, insignificant, and yet removing millimeters one by one will eventually result in someone who is clearly not tall. And the same pattern applies to colours, to wealth, to age, to nearly every predicate we use in ordinary language, and in each case we are forced to accept either that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of grains or hairs or millimeters that marks the transition, which seems arbitrary and implausible, or that there is no boundary at all, which leads to the absurd conclusion that no amount of sand is a heap, no person is bald, no one is tall, because the reasoning that prevents one grain from making a difference applies equally to every grain. The paradox exposes the vagueness inherent in natural language, the fact that most of our concepts do not have sharp boundaries, but instead fade gradually from clear cases to borderline cases to clear non-cases, and this vagueness creates logical problems, because classical logic assumes that every statement is either true or false, that predicates have determinate extensions, that there is a fact of the matter about whether any given collection of sand grains is a heap. But vague predicates resist this bivalent structure, and the Sorites paradox forces us to choose between preserving classical logic and accepting sharp boundaries, or rejecting classical logic and developing new logical systems that can handle vagueness. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept that vague predicates have sharp boundaries, that there is a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, even though we do not and perhaps cannot know what that number is. And they argue that this is no more mysterious than other forms of ignorance. That epistemicism, the view that vagueness is ignorance of sharp boundaries, preserves classical logic at the cost of accepting counterintuitive, hidden thresholds. Others reject sharp boundaries and embrace many-valued logic or fuzzy logic, systems where statements can be partially true, where being a heap admits of degrees, where a collection of grains can be somewhat a heap, more of a heap than another collection, but less of a heap than a third, and truth values range continuously from 0 to 1, rather than being restricted to true and false. Still others argue that vague predicates are context sensitive, that what counts as a heap depends on the purposes and standards operative in a given context, that in some contexts a small pile might count as a heap, while in others only a large pile would, and so there is no absolute fact about heaphood, only relative facts indexed to contexts. The Sorites paradox also has practical implications. In law, where vague terms like reasonable or substantial must be applied to real cases. In medicine, where diagnoses depend on thresholds that are often vague. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require arbitrary boundaries that the Sorite's reasoning undermines. And in these domains, the paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine challenge to decision-making and judgment. The paradox remains unresolved. Philosophers continue to debate the best response, and it stands as a reminder that the concepts we use to navigate the world, the words we rely on to describe and categorize, are far less precise than we ordinarily assume, that vagueness is pervasive, that boundaries are often illusory, and that the attempt to force the fluid and gradual into the rigid and discrete, to impose the structure of classical logic on the messy reality of natural language, leads inevitably to paradox, to situations where reasoning breaks down, where every answer seems wrong, and where the heap, like so many things, resists definition. The Swampman Paradox. Lightning strikes a swamp, and in that instant a man walking through the marsh is vaporized, his body reduced to scattered atoms. And by an extraordinary coincidence, the same lightning strike rearranges nearby organic matter into an exact duplicate of the man, molecule for molecule, synapse for synapse, every memory and personality trait perfectly replicated by chance. And this duplicate, called Swampman by philosopher Donald Davidson, who devised the thought experiment, opens his eyes and continues walking, unaware that anything has happened, believing himself to be the man who entered the swamp moments before. The question that follows is unsettling. Is Swampman the same person as the man who was destroyed? And if not, then what is he? Does he have thoughts, beliefs, desires? Or are his internal states merely physical patterns that resemble mental states without actually being mental states? And this paradox strikes at theories of meaning, content, and personal identity, revealing tensions between physical and historical criteria for mental properties. Davidson argued that Swampman does not have thoughts or beliefs, at least not initially, because the content of mental states depends on causal history, on how those states were formed through interaction with the environment and the linguistic community, and Swampman has no history, no past interactions, no causal connections to the world. His brain states are physically identical to the original man's, but they lack the historical grounding that gives those states their meaning. And so when Swampman seems to think about his wife, he is not actually thinking about anyone, because his internal states have no reference, no connection to the people and things they superficially resemble. This position reflects a broader externalist view in philosophy of mind, the idea that mental content is not determined solely by what is inside the head, but also by external relations, by the history of how beliefs and concepts were acquired, by the environment in which the organism evolved and learned. And so two physically identical beings could have different mental contents, or one could have mental contents while the other has none, depending on their causal histories. Others find this conclusion absurd, arguing that if Swampman is physically identical to the original man, then he must have the same mental states, that consciousness and thought supervene on physical structure, that duplicating the brain duplicates the mind, and that causal history, while perhaps relevant to the origin of mental content, is not necessary for its presence at a given moment. And so Swampman thinks and believes and desires just as the original man did. And any theory that denies this is privileging abstract historical facts over concrete present reality. The Swampman paradox also raises questions about personal identity. If Swampman is not the original man, then he is a distinct person who happens to have identical memories and personality, but those memories are false. They are not his memories because he did not live through the events they seem to record. He came into existence mere seconds ago with a fabricated past, and yet, from the inside, from Swampman's perspective, everything feels continuous and real, and he has no way of discovering the truth about his origins. And this suggests that memory and subjective continuity may be insufficient for personal identity. That being the same person requires some kind of physical or causal continuity that Swampman lacks. The paradox connects to debates about functionalism in philosophy of mind, the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by what they do and how they interact with other states, rather than by their physical composition or history. And functionalism seems to imply that Swampman does have mental states because his brain plays the same functional roles as the original man's brain, and yet this conflicts with externalist intuitions about content. The Swampman thought experiment has been used to explore issues in semantics, the philosophy of language, and theories of reference, showing that our ordinary assumptions about meaning and thought are more complex and fragile than they appear, that the relationship between words and world, between inner states and outer reality, is mediated by history and causation in ways that a snapshot of physical structure cannot capture. Swampman walks through the swamp, indistinguishable from the man who died, living a life that feels real, engaging in actions that seem meaningful, and yet, according to some theories, he is hollow, a zombie of sorts, a being without genuine content, without real thoughts, a perfect imitation of a person who is not quite a person, and the paradox lingers as a question about what makes mental states meaningful, what grounds reference and belief, and whether the inside of the mind is sufficient to constitute a mind, or whether minds require roots in history, connections to the world, threads of causation that link present thoughts to past experiences in ways that brute physical similarity cannot replace. The temporal loop paradox. Time travel narratives often stumble into a peculiar trap, one where causation forms a perfect circle with no discernible beginning, and this is the temporal loop paradox, a scenario where events cause themselves through the mechanism of time travel, creating a chain of causation that has no origin outside the loop itself. Imagine a scientist who receives a mysterious package containing detailed blueprints for a time machine, blueprints that are far beyond anything current science could produce, and the scientist follows these instructions exactly, building the machine over many years, and once it is complete they use it to travel back in time to their younger self, where they mail the very same blueprints that they received decades earlier, and so the blueprints travel from future to past in an endless cycle, created by no one, authored by no one, simply existing within the loop. The paradox is that the information has no source. It was never invented or discovered. It merely circulates through time, and the same pattern can apply to objects, people, or even entire chains of events, creating closed causal loops, where every event is both cause and effect, where nothing enters the loop from outside and nothing leaves, a self-contained system that violates the intuition that everything must have an origin, that causes must precede effects in a linear chain stretching back to some first cause. Some physicists argue that such loops are permitted by the equations of general relativity, which allow for closed time-like curves under certain exotic conditions, space-time paths that circle back on themselves so that travelling forward in time eventually brings you to your own past. And if such curves exist, then temporal loops are possible, strange but not contradictory. Others find the loops deeply troubling, a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that everything must have an explanation, that there must be a reason why the blueprints contain the information they do, but in a temporal loop, there is no reason, no explanation. The information simply is, trapped in eternal recurrence. The loop also raises questions about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that disorder always increases over time. Yet in a temporal loop, information or objects would circulate indefinitely, without decay, never accumulating errors, never losing coherence. And this seems to violate the fundamental arrow of time that thermodynamics imposes. Some theorists suggest that quantum mechanics might prevent such loops, that the probabilistic nature of quantum events would introduce small variations each time the loop repeats, causing the information to degrade over successive iterations until the loop breaks down, while others propose that consistency conditions might force the loop to be stable. That only perfectly self-consistent loops can exist, and any deviation would create contradictions that the universe does not permit. The temporal loop paradox differs from the predestination paradox in emphasis, where predestination focuses on the inevitability of events and the loss of free will. The temporal loop focuses on the absence of origins and the circular nature of causation. And both paradoxes share the unsettling feature that time travel does not change the past because the time traveler was always part of that past, their actions already woven into the fabric of history. The loop sits outside normal causation, neither created nor destroyed, neither beginning nor ending, a strange attractor in the space of possible timelines, and it forces confrontation with the question of whether the universe requires ultimate origins, whether infinite regress is possible, whether some things can simply be without explanation, and whether time is truly linear, or whether it can fold back on itself in ways that make causation circular rather than hierarchical. The temporal loop remains a staple of science fiction and a puzzle for philosophers and physicists, a scenario that feels impossible, yet may be consistent with the laws of nature, a reminder that time is stranger than common sense suggests, and that the arrow of causation we perceive, flowing from past to future, from cause to effect, may not be as fundamental as we believe, may not be the only way events can be structured, and that reality may permit loops and circles where intuition insists there should be lines. The stadium paradox. Zeno of Elea constructed another puzzle about motion, one less famous than his other paradoxes, but perhaps more perplexing, and this is the stadium paradox, sometimes called the moving rows paradox, a thought experiment involving 3 rows of objects moving past each other that seems to prove that half a moment equals a whole moment, that time itself is inconsistent. Imagine 3 rows of objects arranged in a stadium, each row containing the same number of objects. Let us say 4 objects in each row for simplicity, and the first row remains stationary, while the second row moves to the right and the third row moves to the left, each moving at the same speed. At the starting moment, the rows are aligned, but after 1 unit of time, the second row has moved 1 position to the right and the third row has moved 1 position to the left. And here is where the paradox emerges. From the perspective of the stationary first row, each moving row has passed 1 object, but from the perspective of the second row moving right, the third row moving left has passed 2 objects. Because the relative motion between the second and third rows is twice as fast as the motion of either row relative to the stationary row. Zeno argued that this leads to a contradiction, because if the smallest unit of time is the time it takes for one object to pass another, then relative to the first row, 1 unit of time has passed, but relative to the second row, 2 units of time have passed, as measured by how many objects of the third row have gone by. And so the same interval is both 1 unit and 2 units, half of itself and equal to itself, and time becomes incoherent. The paradox is more difficult to grasp than Zeno's other arguments, and even ancient commentators struggled to articulate exactly what the problem was supposed to be, and Aristotle's response was somewhat dismissive, pointing out that the speed of an object depends on the frame of reference, that there is no absolute motion, but only motion relative to other objects, and that the time it takes to pass an object in motion is different from the time it takes to pass a stationary object, and therefore there is no contradiction, merely a confusion about relative velocities. Modern physics has vindicated Aristotle's intuition through the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, and that there is no privileged stationary frame. All motion is relative, and the speed at which objects pass each other depends on the observer's frame of reference. Yet some interpreters suggest that Zeno's stadium paradox was actually an early glimpse of the relativity of motion, an attempt to show that if motion is real, then there can be no absolute measure of speed or time, and that this was meant to support Parmenides' claim that motion is an illusion. Others argue that the paradox reveals an implicit assumption about the discrete nature of space and time, that Zeno may have been imagining space as a grid of discrete positions and time as a sequence of discrete moments, and that the paradox arises from trying to reconcile continuous motion with discrete structure, a tension that would not be fully addressed until the development of calculus and later quantum mechanics. The paradox also touches on the concept of relative velocity, the idea that the speed of one object relative to another is the sum of their individual speeds if they are moving in opposite directions, and that this is perfectly consistent even though it means different observers measure different relative speeds. In a sense, the stadium paradox is less about motion itself and more about the consistency of measurement, the question of whether time and space have absolute units, or whether all measurements are relative to the observer. And this question would not be fully answered until Einstein's theories of special and general relativity in the 20th century, which showed that time itself is not absolute, but depends on the relative motion and gravitational fields of the observer. Zeno's stadium sits quietly in the history of philosophy, overshadowed by his more famous paradoxes, yet it contains within it the seeds of ideas that would take 2,000 years to fully develop: the relativity of motion, the frame dependence of measurement, the question of whether space and time are discrete or continuous, and the paradox remains a reminder that even the simplest scenarios, 3 rows of objects moving past each other, can conceal deep questions about the nature of reality, questions that our intuitions cannot easily answer, questions that require centuries of thought and mathematics to even begin to unravel. The ship of Theseus. A ship returns to harbour after a long voyage, its wooden planks weathered and damaged by storms and salt, and the repairs begin. One plank is removed and replaced with new wood, then another, and over months or years every single plank, every beam, every nail is replaced until nothing of the original materials remains. And yet it is still called the Ship of Theseus, still registered under the same name, still captained by the same crew, and the question arises, is it the same ship or a different ship? And if it is different, when did it become different? After the first plank was replaced, or the 10th, or the last, and where is the boundary between identity and change? The paradox is ancient, discussed by Greek and Roman philosophers, and it strikes at the heart of what it means for an object to persist through time, to remain itself despite losing and gaining parts. And the problem deepens when a second scenario is introduced. Imagine that all the original planks removed from the ship of Theseus are collected and stored, and then using only those original materials, a second ship is built, an exact replica assembled from the very wood that once formed the ship of Theseus. And now there are 2 ships, one that has been continuously repaired and one that is made entirely of the original materials. And which one is the true ship of Theseus, the one with continuity of form and function, or the one with continuity of material? The paradox has no clear answer, and different philosophical traditions offer different responses. Some argue that identity is determined by material composition, that an object is the sum of its parts, and so the ship made from original planks is the true ship of Theseus, even though it was disassembled and reassembled, while others argue that identity is determined by form and function, that what makes the ship is its structure and purpose, and so the continuously repaired ship retains its identity, even though none of its original material remains. Still others suggest that identity is conventional, a matter of social agreement and practical convenience, that there is no objective fact about which ship is the real ship of Theseus, only a question of what we choose to call it based on our needs and conventions. The paradox extends beyond ships to living organisms because the cells in the human body are constantly dying and being replaced. And over a period of years, almost every atom in the body is exchanged with the environment. And yet a person is considered the same person throughout their life. And so, what makes identity persist? Is it continuity of consciousness, continuity of memory, continuity of physical form, or something else entirely? The problem also appears in legal and ethical contexts. Questions about personal responsibility over time, whether a person who has changed dramatically is still accountable for actions committed decades earlier, whether a corporation that has replaced all its employees and assets is still the same entity bound by old contracts, whether a nation that has undergone revolution and transformation retains the obligations of its former government. Some philosophers embrace a four-dimensionalist view, arguing that objects are not three-dimensional things that persist through time, but four-dimensional space-time worms, extended through time as well as space, and that what we call the ship of Theseus is really a temporally extended object, a continuous path through space-time, and the question of identity becomes a question of how we slice that four-dimensional object into temporal parts. Others reject this view, insisting that objects exist wholly at each moment, that the ship of Theseus at one time is numerically identical to the ship of Theseus at another time, if there is the right kind of continuity between them, though what counts as the right kind of continuity remains disputed. The ship of Theseus paradox remains unsolved, a puzzle that philosophy has examined for over 2 millennia without reaching consensus, and it stands as a reminder that identity, persistence, and change are not as straightforward as they seem, that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is one of the deepest and most difficult in metaphysics, and that the world we navigate, full of objects and people and institutions that seem to endure, may be far more fluid and ambiguous than common sense suggests. The surprise examination paradox. A teacher announces to a class on Friday afternoon that there will be a surprise examination sometime during the following week, and the examination will be a surprise in the sense that the students will not know on which day it will occur until the morning of the examination itself. And this announcement seems straightforward, even cruel perhaps, but harmless from a logical standpoint. Yet one clever student raises a hand and argues that the surprise examination is impossible, that it cannot occur, and the reasoning goes as follows. The examination cannot be on Friday, because if it has not occurred by the end of Thursday, then the students will know it must be on Friday, and therefore it will not be a surprise, and if Friday is ruled out, then the examination cannot be on Thursday either, because if it has not occurred by the end of Wednesday, then the students will know it must be on Thursday, since Friday has been eliminated, and therefore it will not be a surprise. And this reasoning continues backward through the week, eliminating Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday in turn, until the student concludes that the surprise examination cannot occur on any day of the week, that the teacher's announcement is self-contradictory, that a surprise examination is logically impossible. The class relaxes, confident in this reasoning, and then on Wednesday morning the teacher administers the examination, and the students are indeed surprised, and this outcome seems to vindicate the teacher and refute the student's argument. Yet the student's reasoning appeared sound. Each step seemed to follow logically from the previous one, and so a paradox emerges. The surprise examination both is and is not possible. The student's proof that it cannot occur is seemingly valid, yet the examination does occur and is genuinely surprising, and philosophers and logicians have puzzled over this paradox for decades, proposing various resolutions but reaching no consensus. One approach is to question what surprise means, to argue that the student's reasoning equivocates between different senses of surprise or knowledge, that ruling out Friday does not give the students the kind of knowledge that would make Thursday non-surprising, because the teacher could change plans, could decide not to give an examination at all, could be mistaken about the week, and so even if the students can deduce that the examination must be on Thursday if it occurs that week, they do not know with certainty that it will occur, and this residual uncertainty preserves the possibility of surprise. Another approach focuses on the self-referential nature of the announcement, arguing that the student's reasoning involves a kind of paradox of self-reference, similar to the liar paradox, because the teacher's announcement refers to the student's knowledge state, claiming that they will not know when the examination occurs, and the student's reasoning attempts to derive knowledge about the examination from the announcement itself, creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on whether the students believe it, and this loop generates instability, making it impossible to consistently assign truth values to the claims involved. Still another approach suggests that the student's backward induction reasoning is flawed, that while it is true that the examination cannot be on Friday, if the students know this in advance, the elimination of Friday does not straightforwardly imply that Thursday can also be eliminated, because the reasoning that rules out Thursday depends on the students believing that Friday is ruled out. But if the examination could in fact occur on Friday, despite the reasoning, then the entire chain of deductions collapses. And this highlights a problem with self-fulfilling or self-defeating prophecies, situations where believing a conclusion affects whether the conclusion is true. The surprise examination paradox also connects to issues in epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief. Because the paradox involves nested levels of knowledge, the teacher knows that the students do not know when the examination will occur, the students know that the teacher knows this, and so on, and reasoning about such nested knowledge structures is notoriously tricky, prone to paradoxes and fallacies, and formal epistemic logic provides tools for analysing these structures, but also reveals their complexity and the ease with which intuitive reasoning can go astray. The paradox has applications beyond the classroom, appearing in game theory and strategic reasoning, where players must reason about what other players know and believe, and where backward induction arguments, similar to the student's reasoning, are used to solve sequential games. But these arguments can lead to counterintuitive results, situations where seemingly sound reasoning produces predictions that are violated in practice, and the surprise examination paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of such reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise itself, whether surprise is a psychological state, a relation between expectations and events, or a logical property of statements and situations, and whether it is coherent to announce in advance that something will be surprising, because the act of announcing seems to undermine the surprise, yet in practice surprise examinations do occur and are surprising, and so perhaps surprise is not as fragile as the student's reasoning suggests. Perhaps it is compatible with some forms of foreknowledge, with knowing that something will happen without knowing when or how. The teacher's announcement, the student's reasoning, and the actual occurrence of the examination on Wednesday form a triangle of tension, each element seemingly incompatible with the others, yet all actually occurring, and the paradox remains unresolved, a puzzle that continues to generate papers and debates, a simple scenario that conceals deep issues about knowledge, belief, time, and the logic of self-reference. And it stands as a reminder that reasoning, even careful logical reasoning, can lead us astray when the premises involve reflexive concepts, when statements refer to their own truth or to the knowledge states of those who hear them, and that the gap between theory and practice, between what logic seems to prove and what actually happens, can reveal faults in our logical frameworks or in our understanding of concepts like knowledge and surprise, or perhaps in the very idea that logic can fully capture the complexities of situations involving human belief and expectation, and the examination comes unexpected despite the announcement, surprising despite the reasoning, and the students, shocked and unprepared, realize that the paradox is not merely abstract but painfully real, and the teacher smiles, victorious, having somehow managed to do the impossible, to give a surprise examination that was announced in advance, and yet remained a surprise, and the paradox endures, unsolved, and perhaps unsolvable, a crack in the edifice of logical reasoning that no amount of analysis has yet managed to seal. The stone paradox, another way to ask if God can defeat God's self. The question appears in different forms across centuries, always pointing to the same underlying puzzle about unlimited power, and one formulation asks whether an all-powerful being can create a stone so massive that even infinite strength cannot move it. And this is the stone paradox, essentially identical to the omnipotence paradox, but focusing specifically on physical objects and physical power. And the logic is the same. Either the being can create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot do, namely move the stone, or the being cannot create the unmovable stone, which means there is something the being cannot create, and in both cases the being's power has limits. And the concept of all-powerful collapses, and this formulation emphasizes the physical, intuitive aspect of the puzzle, makes it concrete, gives it visual force, because we can imagine trying to lift a stone, imagine straining against weight, and the idea of a stone too heavy for even infinite strength captures the paradox in a visceral way that abstract formulations about logical possibility sometimes miss. Imagine the stone, vast beyond imagining, extending across space, dense with compressed matter, so heavy that it curves space-time around itself, creates gravitational wells, warps reality by its mere presence, and the being approaches, grasps the stone, applies force, and the stone does not move, remains fixed in space, immovable. And this defeat, this failure, seems to show that the being is not all-powerful, and yet the being created this stone, shaped it specifically to be unmovable. And if the being can create such a stone, then the being has a power that contradicts itself, a power to create constraints that the power itself cannot overcome. And this self-defeating power seems incoherent, seems to be no power at all. And so we are driven back to the conclusion that creating such a stone is impossible. But then the being cannot create everything imaginable, cannot create every physical object, and again, the being is not all-powerful. The stone paradox is sometimes presented as a reductio ad absurdum of the concept of omnipotence, an argument that shows omnipotence is logically impossible, that no being could have unlimited power, that power must have limits, and if omnipotence is impossible, then no being is omnipotent, not even God. And this conclusion challenges traditional theology, challenges the claim that God is all-powerful, and requires either rejecting omnipotence as a divine attribute or redefining it in a way that avoids the paradox. And theologians have generally chosen the second option, have argued that omnipotence does not mean literally unlimited power, but rather maximal power consistent with logical coherence. And this means God can do anything that is logically possible, but not things that involve contradictions. And creating an unmovable stone that one can then move is a contradiction. And so God's inability to do it is not a limitation, but a reflection of logical necessity. The stone paradox also has variants involving self-limitation, questions about whether God can limit God's own power, can voluntarily give up omnipotence, can create a situation where God is no longer all-powerful. And these questions are theologically interesting because they relate to the incarnation, to the Christian claim that God became human in Christ. And being human involves limitations, involves not being omnipotent, and so did God limit divine power when becoming incarnate? And if so, does this mean God is no longer omnipotent? And if God can limit divine power, does this show that God is not essentially omnipotent? And these questions have generated extensive theological debate about the relationship between Christ's human nature and divine nature, about whether limitations apply to God as a whole or only to the human aspect. And the stone paradox in these variants touches on central mysteries of Christology and Trinitarian theology. The paradox can also be understood as a question about necessity and possibility, about whether there are constraints that even an all-powerful being must respect, And the response that God cannot do logically impossible things is a claim that logical necessity is more fundamental than power. That even God cannot violate logic, and this has implications for metaphysics, for the question of what grounds logical truths, whether they are independent of God or created by God. And if they are independent, then there is something God does not control, something that limits divine sovereignty. And if they are created by God, then the claim that God cannot violate logic becomes the claim that God cannot do what God has decided is impossible. And this seems to restore divine sovereignty, but raises questions about whether God could have made different logical truths, could have made contradictions possible. And these questions push the limits of coherent thought. Some philosophers have argued that the stone paradox shows that power itself is incoherent as an unlimited concept, that just as there cannot be a largest possible number, because any number can be exceeded by adding one, there cannot be an unlimited power, because any supposed unlimited power can be challenged by asking whether it can create a limit to itself. And this suggests that power is always relational, always defined relative to tasks and capacities. And the idea of absolute power, power not relative to anything, is an illusion, a category mistake. And so the paradox does not refute the existence of very powerful beings, does not show that God cannot be maximally powerful within the constraints of coherence, but it does show that certain formulations of omnipotence, certain claims about unlimited power, are not logically tenable. The stone sits in conceptual space, hypothetical and impossible, and the being stands before it, and the question hangs: can the stone be created? Can it be moved? And the answer shapes theology, shapes metaphysics, shapes our understanding of what power is and what limits even ultimate power must respect. And the stone paradox remains a vivid, concrete formulation of deep abstract questions about possibility, coherence, and the boundaries of divine ability. And it stands alongside the omnipotence paradox as a permanent challenge to simplistic claims about unlimited power. A reminder that even theology must answer to logic, that concepts must cohere, and that the nature of God, if God exists, is more subtle and more constrained by reason than some believers want to admit. And the stone paradox persists, waiting in every discussion of omnipotence, ready to challenge every claim that God can do anything, pushing always toward qualification, toward clarification, toward the recognition that anything means anything logically possible, and that even divine power operates within the bounds of coherence. The skeptical paradox. The ancient skeptics posed a question that has haunted philosophy ever since. How can we know anything at all? How can we justify our beliefs about the external world when those beliefs rest on foundations that are themselves uncertain, when every justification requires further justification in an endless regress? And this is the skeptical paradox, the problem that knowledge seems both necessary for action and impossible to achieve, that we cannot help but believe and claim to know, yet we cannot provide the kind of justification that would ground those claims in certainty. The skeptical argument takes many forms. One of the most powerful begins with the observation that our beliefs about the external world are based on sensory experience. We believe there is a table in front of us because we see it and touch it. But sensory experience can be misleading. Illusions and hallucinations occur. Dreams feel real while we are dreaming them. And so the mere fact that we have a certain experience does not guarantee that the world is as the experience represents it. And this means that our sensory experiences underdetermine our beliefs about the world. The same experiences could be produced by a real table, by a hallucination, by a detailed dream, or by a Cartesian demon systematically deceiving us. And if we cannot rule out these skeptical scenarios, then we cannot know that the table is real, and this reasoning applies to all our beliefs about the external world. None of them are certain. All are vulnerable to skeptical doubt. The skeptic does not claim to know that we are deceived, only that we cannot know we are not deceived. And this is enough to undermine knowledge, because knowledge seems to require not just true belief, but justified true belief. And justification seems to require being able to rule out relevant alternatives. And the skeptical scenarios are relevant alternatives that we cannot rule out, at least not without begging the question, not without assuming the very thing we are trying to prove, that our senses are reliable, that the external world exists, that we are not dreaming or deceived. The skeptical paradox is that we seem to have two incompatible intuitions. On the one hand, we are convinced that we know many things, that we know there is a table in front of us, that we know we have hands, that we know the earth is round, and these beliefs seem as certain as anything could be. And on the other hand, we find the skeptical arguments compelling. We recognize that we cannot prove we are not deceived, that the possibility of systematic error cannot be ruled out by any non-circular reasoning. And so, we oscillate between certainty and doubt, between the conviction that skepticism is absurd and the recognition that we cannot refute it. Descartes attempted to escape skepticism through his method of doubt, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached the indubitable foundation cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, the one truth that even the most radical skepticism cannot undermine, because to doubt that one exists is to presuppose that there is someone doing the doubting. And from this foundation, Descartes tried to rebuild knowledge, proving the existence of God and using God's benevolence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. But few philosophers have found this reconstruction convincing. The arguments for God's existence are controversial, and even if successful, they would not close the gap between subjective certainty and objective truth, between what seems clear and what actually is. Hume took skepticism more seriously, arguing that we have no rational justification for believing in causation, induction, or the existence of an external world, that these beliefs are products of custom and habit rather than reason, that we believe because we cannot help but believe, because our psychology compels us, not because we have good arguments. And Hume distinguished between philosophical skepticism, the theoretical position that knowledge is impossible, and practical certainty, the psychological inevitability of belief and action. And he suggested that we can acknowledge the force of skeptical arguments in the study while setting them aside in ordinary life. Though this division between theory and practice remains uncomfortable, a kind of intellectual schizophrenia where we admit that our beliefs are unjustified, yet continue to hold them anyway. Kant responded to Hume by arguing that skepticism rests on a mistake, the assumption that knowledge requires correspondence between our representations and things as they are in themselves, independent of our cognitive faculties. And Kant argued that this assumption is incoherent, that we can only know things as they appear to us, as structured by the forms of intuition and the categories of understanding, and that the question of how things are independently of these structures is meaningless, not answerable even in principle. And so skepticism about the external world is based on a confused demand, a demand for a kind of knowledge that is conceptually impossible, and Kant's transcendental idealism attempts to secure the objectivity of knowledge by relativizing it to the conditions of possible experience, making knowledge possible by making it more modest, more limited, no longer claiming to grasp things in themselves, but only things as they appear within the framework of human cognition. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to skepticism. Externalist theories argue that knowledge does not require the ability to rule out all skeptical scenarios, that knowledge requires only that beliefs be produced by reliable processes or track the truth in certain ways. And on these views we can know we have hands, even if we cannot prove we are not brains in vats. Because in the actual world, our perceptual beliefs are reliably formed, and the fact that we cannot distinguish the actual world from a skeptical scenario does not undermine knowledge as long as we are in fact in the actual world, and our beliefs are in fact reliably formed. Contextualist theories argue that the standards for knowledge vary with context, that in ordinary contexts, skeptical scenarios are not relevant, and we can truly claim to know many things, while in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are explicitly raised, the standards become more demanding and knowledge claims become false. And this allows us to preserve both the intuition that we know many things in everyday life, and the intuition that skeptical arguments are powerful in philosophical inquiry, by treating these as claims about knowledge in different contexts with different standards. The skeptical paradox remains unresolved. No consensus has emerged about how to respond to skeptical arguments, and different philosophers find different responses more or less satisfying depending on their broader commitments about the nature of knowledge, justification, and the mind's relationship to the world. And the paradox continues to drive epistemological theorizing, forcing philosophers to clarify what they mean by knowledge, what conditions must be met for a belief to count as knowledge, and whether the concept of knowledge we ordinarily employ is coherent or whether it contains internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The skeptic sits in doubt, questioning everything, unable to claim knowledge, yet unable to stop believing, and the rest of us navigates between confidence and uncertainty, acting as if we know, while acknowledging in quieter moments that our knowledge rests on foundations that are less secure than we would like, that the gap between appearance and reality cannot be fully closed, that the possibility of error cannot be eliminated, and that knowledge, if it exists at all, is more fragile and more difficult to achieve than common sense suggests. And the paradox endures, the ancient puzzle that will not die, the question that philosophy cannot answer but cannot stop asking, and we continue to believe, to claim to know, to act with confidence, while the skeptic watches and waits, reminding us that certainty is elusive, that doubt is always possible, that the foundations of knowledge are shakier than they appear. The St. Petersburg Paradox. A casino offers a game with a simple rule. A fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands tails, and the player receives a payout that depends on the number of flips. If tails appears on the first flip, the payout is $2. If tails appears on the second flip, the payout is $4. If on the third flip, $8, and so on, doubling with each additional flip. And the question posed by the mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in 1738 is this: how much should a rational person be willing to pay this game? What is the fair price for a ticket? And the expected value calculation gives a shocking answer. The expected value is infinite, because the probability of tails appearing on the first flip is 1/2, and the payout is $2, contributing $1 to the expected value, and the probability of tails appearing on the second flip is 1/4, and the payout is $4, contributing another $1, and this pattern continues forever, each outcome contributing $1 to the expected value. And since there are infinitely many outcomes, the expected value is infinite. And yet no reasonable person would pay a large sum to play this game, let alone an infinite amount. And this gap between the infinite expected value and the finite amount people are actually willing to pay is the St. Petersburg Paradox, a puzzle that challenged the theory that rational agents maximize expected value and led to the development of expected utility theory and the concept of diminishing marginal utility. The paradox reveals that expected value, calculated as the sum of each outcome's value multiplied by its probability, may not be the appropriate guide for decision-making, because expected value treats dollars linearly, assumes that $10 is worth exactly 10 times as much as $1, and that $1 million is worth exactly 1,000,000 times as much. But this does not capture how people actually value money. For most people, the value of money exhibits diminishing marginal utility. The first dollar is worth more in terms of welfare than the second dollar, which is worth more than the third, and so on. And $1 million does not provide 1,000,000 times as much satisfaction as $1. And when utility, rather than dollar value, is used to calculate expectations, the St. Petersburg paradox can be resolved. Because even though the dollar payouts grow without bound, the utility of those payouts may converge to a finite value, and so the expected utility of the game is finite. And a rational agent should be willing to pay at most that finite expected utility to play. Daniel Bernoulli proposed that utility is logarithmic in wealth, that the utility of having X dollars is proportional to the logarithm of X. And under this assumption, the expected utility of the St. Petersburg game is finite, and the fair price to play is modest, a few dollars perhaps, in line with what people are actually willing to pay. And this resolution saved the principle of expected utility maximization, showing that the paradox arises not from a flaw in decision theory, but from using the wrong measure of value, from confusing money with utility. And Bernoulli's insight laid the groundwork for modern economics and decision theory, which routinely assume that utility is concave in wealth, that people are risk-averse, that they prefer a certain outcome to a gamble with the same expected value, and that this risk aversion reflects diminishing marginal utility. But the St. Petersburg paradox has deeper layers, because even the expected utility resolution can be challenged. Mathematicians have constructed super St. Petersburg games where the payouts grow so rapidly that expected utility is also infinite, even under logarithmic utility or any concave utility function. For instance, if the payout on flip n is not 2 to the power of n dollars, but 2 to the power of 2 to the power of n, or some even faster growing function, then expected utility under any reasonable utility function will be infinite. And so the paradox reappears, and this suggests that the problem is not merely about the choice of value function, but about how to handle infinite or unbounded expectations. And some decision theorists argue that games with infinite expected value or utility are ill-defined, that they fall outside the domain of expected utility theory, that the theory was never meant to handle such cases and should not be faulted for failing to do so. Others propose alternative decision theories, bounded utility functions where utility approaches a maximum, as wealth increases so that no payout, however large, has infinite utility, and under such functions, all expected utilities are finite. And the paradox is avoided, or they propose maximum principles where the agent focuses on the worst possible outcome, or they appeal to considerations of probability and belief, arguing that rational agents should not assign positive probability to arbitrarily unlikely events, that there is some threshold below which probabilities are treated as zero, and this truncation of the probability distribution renders expected values finite. The paradox also raises questions about the feasibility of the game, because no casino could actually pay out arbitrarily large sums. The maximum payout is limited by the casino's resources, and once this limit is imposed, the expected value becomes finite, and the paradox dissolves. But this response feels unsatisfying, like avoiding the problem rather than solving it, because the paradox is meant to be a thought experiment about rational decision-making, not a practical question about casino economics. And thought experiments should not be dismissed simply because they involve idealizations. The St. Petersburg paradox connects to debates about rationality and the nature of value, about whether rationality requires maximizing expected utility or whether other principles should guide decision-making, about whether value is unbounded or whether there are limits to how much anything can be worth, about how to handle uncertainty and risk, especially when probabilities are very small and payoffs are very large, and these questions have implications far beyond gambling, for insurance, for investment, for policy decisions involving catastrophic risks like pandemics or asteroid impacts, where the probabilities are tiny, but the potential costs or benefits are enormous, and the paradox shows that expected value reasoning can give counterintuitive or unhelpful guidance in such cases, that we may need other frameworks, other ways of thinking, about decision-making under extreme uncertainty. The coin is flipped, tails appears eventually, the game ends, the payout is made, and the player receives some finite amount, usually small, rarely large, almost never enormous, and the expected value, calculated before the game began, was infinite. But this infinity is never realized, never paid out, never experienced, and so the paradox asks whether infinite expected value is meaningful, whether it should guide decisions, whether a rational agent should treat an infinite expectation differently from a very large finite one. And the answers are not obvious, not settled, not agreed upon, and the St. Petersburg paradox remains a puzzle, a test case for decision theory, a challenge to the principle of expected value maximization, a reminder that infinity is strange, that unbounded sequences create problems, that mathematical idealizations can clash with practical intuitions, and that the gap between theory and behavior, between what agents should do according to formal models and what they actually do, reveals something important about the limits of rationality, the role of psychology, the nature of value, and the difficulty of making decisions in a world where outcomes can vary wildly, where probabilities can be minuscule, and where the mathematics of expectation, taken to its logical extreme, produces results that seem absurd, untenable, impossible to act on, and the paradox endures, studied in classrooms, debated in journals, unresolved despite centuries of attention, a permanent fixture in the philosophy of probability, economics, and decision theory. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol, and if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot. Remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize two systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these two uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind, like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensoromotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval, and so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, and whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The rubber hand illusion, when a fake hand becomes yours. A person sits at a table, their real hand hidden from view behind a screen, and a rubber hand, a realistic prosthetic, is placed in front of them where they can see it. And the experimenter uses two paintbrushes, simultaneously stroking the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand in synchrony. The same strokes at the same times on corresponding locations. And after several minutes, something strange happens. The person begins to feel as though the rubber hand is their hand, feels the touch sensations as coming from the rubber hand rather than from the hidden real hand. And when the experimenter threatens the rubber hand, moves a hammer toward it, as if to strike, the person flinches, shows a physiological stress response, reacts as though the rubber hand is in danger. And this is the rubber hand illusion, discovered by Botvinnik and Cohen in 1998. A phenomenon demonstrating that body ownership, the sense that a body part is yours, is not fixed but is flexible, can be manipulated, can be extended to objects that are not part of your body. And the illusion reveals that the sense of body ownership is constructed by the brain through integration of visual, tactile, and proprioceptive information. And when these signals are consistent, when vision shows a hand being touched in the same way, and at the same time as tactile signals indicate your hand is being touched, the brain infers that the seen hand is your hand, updates the body representation, and the rubber hand is incorporated into the body schema. And the rubber hand illusion has profound implications for understanding embodiment, for understanding the sense of self, for prosthetic design, and for recognizing that the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are dynamic and constructed. Imagine the subjective experience. You watch the rubber hand, see the paintbrush stroke it, and simultaneously feel strokes on your real hidden hand. And at first the rubber hand is clearly not yours, is obviously a fake. But as the synchronous stroking continues, something shifts. The rubber hand begins to feel like it could be yours, begins to feel connected, and after several minutes, the feeling is strong. The rubber hand feels like part of your body, and when you're asked to close your eyes and point to where your real hand is, your pointing is shifted toward the rubber hand. You mislocalize your real hand, place it closer to the rubber hand than it actually is, and this proprioceptive drift shows that the body representation has been updated, has incorporated the rubber hand. And the illusion is not just a belief, but is a genuine perceptual shift, a change in how your body feels and where it feels located. The rubber hand illusion demonstrates multisensory integration, shows that the brain combines information from different senses to construct a coherent representation of the body. And when visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals are consistent, they are attributed to the same body part, and the brain updates the body schema accordingly. And the rubber hand, despite being visibly fake, is integrated because the signals are consistent. vision and touch agree, and the brain prioritizes consistency over implausibility, treats the consistent signals as evidence of body ownership, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is not simply given by innate body knowledge, but is actively maintained through continuous multisensory integration. And the boundaries of the body are flexible, can be extended or contracted depending on sensory evidence. Visualize the body schema as a dynamic map, a neural representation of the body's configuration and boundaries. And this map is constantly updated based on sensory input, is adjusted to reflect current body state. And the rubber hand illusion shows that the map can be manipulated, can be made to include external objects, if the right sensory conditions are met. And this flexibility is adaptive, allows the body schema to incorporate tools and prosthetics, allows extension of the sense of embodiment beyond biological boundaries. And the illusion demonstrates this flexibility, shows that a rubber hand can be treated as real, can be incorporated into the body schema, can evoke proprioceptive shifts and emotional responses. The rubber hand illusion has practical applications for prosthetic design, for helping amputees incorporate artificial limbs, for creating prosthetics that feel like part of the body rather than like external tools, and understanding the conditions that produce the illusion, the need for synchronous multisensory stimulation, informs how prosthetics should provide feedback, how they should integrate visual and tactile signals. And the illusion has been used therapeutically, has been adapted to treat phantom limb pain, to help amputees resolve conflicts between visual evidence of absence and proprioceptive evidence of presence, and the techniques developed from studying the illusion have real clinical value. The illusion also has implications for understanding the self, for recognizing that the sense of body ownership is not a simple direct given, but is a constructed representation, is inferred from sensory evidence, and the self, at least the bodily self, is flexible, is not fixed by biological boundaries. And this challenges naive views of the self as a simple unity, as transparently given, and supports views that the self is constructed, is a model built by the brain, and the model can be manipulated, can include or exclude body parts depending on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion shows this manipulation directly, shows that body ownership can be experimentally induced for fake limbs. And this raises questions about personal identity, about what makes a body part yours, about whether ownership is determined by biological connection or by sensory integration, and the illusion suggests the latter. One variant of the rubber hand illusion uses virtual reality, uses computer-generated hands that can be manipulated more precisely than rubber hands, can change appearance, can violate physical constraints, and virtual embodiment studies have shown that people can experience ownership of virtual bodies, can incorporate digital hands into their body schema. And this has applications for VR design, for creating immersive experiences, for understanding how to make virtual avatars feel like real bodies. And the principles discovered through the rubber hand illusion extend to virtual embodiment, show that the same multisensory integration mechanisms apply, and synchronous visuotactile stimulation produces ownership of virtual limbs just as it does for rubber limbs. Another variant explores whether the illusion extends beyond hands, whether legs or whole bodies can be incorporated, and studies have shown that full body illusions are possible, that people can experience ownership of entire mannequin bodies or virtual avatars when appropriate multisensory stimulation is provided. And these full body illusions demonstrate that body ownership is global, applies to the entire body representation, and can be manipulated systematically. And the flexibility of body ownership is even greater than the rubber hand illusion alone suggests, extends to whole body reconfiguration. And this has implications for understanding disorders of body ownership, for understanding phantom limbs and body integrity identity disorder, and for developing therapeutic interventions. The rubber hand sits on the table, fake and obvious, and yet after synchronous stroking, it feels real, feels like part of the body, and the person flinches when it is threatened, responds emotionally and physiologically as though their real hand is in danger, and the illusion reveals that body ownership is constructed, is inferred from multisensory consistency, is flexible and dynamic, and the boundaries of the self are not fixed but are continuously updated based on sensory evidence. And the rubber hand illusion endures as one of the most striking demonstrations in cognitive neuroscience, a phenomenon that challenges assumptions about embodiment, that reveals the constructed nature of the bodily self, and that shows that even the most basic sense, the sense of which body parts are yours, is not simply given but is actively maintained through brain processes that can be fooled, can be manipulated, and the rubber hand becomes real, becomes incorporated, and the illusion persists. The Sleeping Beauty problem. A woman volunteers for an unusual experiment in probability and subjective credence, an experiment that will test how she should reason about her own situation when her memory has been manipulated. And the setup is as follows. On Sunday she's put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed briefly, and then the experiment ends. But if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, given a drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening, put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed again, and then the experiment ends. And the crucial feature is that whenever she is awakened, she cannot tell whether it is Monday or Tuesday, cannot tell whether the coin landed heads or tails. She knows only that she is awake and being interviewed. And the question posed to philosophers and decision theorists is this: when Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed, what should her credence be that the coin landed heads? What probability should she assign to heads given her situation and her knowledge? The problem divides respondents into two camps, the halfers and the thirders, and each position has compelling arguments. Yet they reach opposite conclusions, creating a paradox that reveals deep tensions in how we think about probability, information, and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that Sleeping Beauty should maintain her prior credence of one half, because the coin is fair and nothing she learns upon awakening provides evidence about how it landed. She knew before the experiment that she would be awakened at least once, and being awakened is guaranteed regardless of the coin outcome, and so the awakening provides no new information, no reason to update her probability, and therefore she should stick with one half. And this reasoning seems straightforward, seems to respect the principle that probabilities should only change when new evidence is acquired, and being awakened is not new evidence because it was certain to happen. The thirders argue that Sleeping Beauty should assign credence 1/3 to heads, because there are three possible awakening situations: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. And from her perspective, upon awakening, these three situations are indistinguishable. She cannot tell which one she is in, and by a principle of indifference among indistinguishable possibilities, she should assign equal probability to each, 1/3 to each. And since heads corresponds to only one of these situations, heads Monday, while tails corresponds to two, tails Monday and tails Tuesday, her credence in heads should be 1/3, and her credence in tails should be 2/3. And this reasoning seems to respect the information that if the coin landed tails, she is twice as likely to be awakened, that her current awakening is more probable under tails than under heads. And this should shift her credence toward tails. The disagreement between halfers and thirders reflects a deeper question about what credences represent and how they should be updated. Halfers tend to interpret credence as tracking objective chance, the physical probability of the coin flip, which is 1/2 and does not change based on Sleeping Beauty's subjective situation, while thirders interpret credence as tracking epistemic probability, the rational degree of belief given all available information, including self-locating information. And from this perspective, Sleeping Beauty's situation upon awakening is evidence that favours Tails, because Tails generates more awakenings and therefore more situations in which she finds herself awakened and uncertain. The problem becomes more vivid when decision-theoretic stakes are introduced. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she is awakened, a bet that pays if heads and costs if tails, and she must decide whether to accept. And now the question is what odds she should demand to make the bet fair, and halfers say she should demand even odds, 1-to-1, because the coin is fair, while thirders say she should demand 2-to-1 odds in favour of tails, because she is more likely to be betting in a tails scenario where she will lose. And when the bet is actually offered and payoffs are calculated, the thirder strategy performs better, winning more money on average. And this seems to vindicate the thirder position, to show that 1/3 is the correct credence for guiding decisions. Yet Holfers respond that this merely shows a difference between epistemic credence and decision-making strategy, that the correct probability of heads is still 1/2, even if the correct betting strategy involves different odds. The Sleeping Beauty problem also raises questions about the reference class problem, the question of which group of situations Sleeping Beauty should consider herself a random member of. Should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of coin flips, in which case heads and tails are equally likely, or should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of awakening events, in which case tails is twice as likely, and different reference classes lead to different probabilities, and there is no obviously correct way to choose between them. The problem connects to issues about personal identity and indexical information about who or when or where you are, because Sleeping Beauty, upon awakening, does not learn any new dicto information, any new information about how the world is. She already knew that she would be awakened at least once, but she does gain new deci information. New information about which temporal slice of herself she currently is. New information about her location in time. And the question is whether this indexical information should change her credences, whether learning that you're currently experiencing an awakening provides evidence about the coin, even if you knew that you would experience at least one awakening. Some philosophers propose middle positions, arguing that different notions of probability are at play, and that the halfer and thirder answers are both correct relative to different interpretive frameworks, or that the question is underspecified and cannot be answered without further stipulations about what is being asked. But these conciliatory approaches satisfy neither halfers nor thirders, each of whom believes their answer is the uniquely correct one. The problem has spawned an enormous literature, with variants and extensions testing different aspects of the puzzle, versions with different probabilities for the coin, versions with different numbers of awakenings, versions where Sleeping Beauty is told what day it is, and each variant sharpens the intuitions or reveals new complications, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Conferences are held, papers are written, arguments are refined, and the community remains divided. And this persistence suggests that the Sleeping Beauty problem may not have a single correct answer, may instead reveal an ambiguity or indeterminacy in the concept of rational credence, a place where our intuitions pull in different directions, and no amount of formalization fully captures what is at stake. Sleeping Beauty lies in the laboratory, awakened and interviewed, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, uncertain whether the coin landed heads or tails, and she must assign a probability, must decide what to believe. And the philosophers watching cannot agree on what she should say, cannot agree on whether her credence should be 1/2 or 1/3, and the experiment continues. The coin is flipped again and again. Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed again and again, and the paradox persists, a puzzle that seems simple, a question about a coin flip and some awakenings, yet contains within it deep disagreements about probability, evidence, identity, and the nature of rational belief. And no solution has won consensus, no argument has settled the debate, and Sleeping Beauty remains caught between halfers and thirders, between two ways of understanding her situation, two ways of reasoning about uncertainty, and perhaps there is no fact of the matter, no correct answer, only different frameworks that give different results. And the choice between them reflects philosophical commitments rather than mathematical necessity, and the problem endures, a touchstone in debates about probability, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that generates endless discussion, yet no agreement, and Sleeping Beauty wakes and wonders, and assigns her credence, and the debate continues, without end, without resolution, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical paradoxes. The Simpsons Paradox. A pharmaceutical company tests a new drug, comparing it to an existing treatment, and the study involves two populations, men and women, and when the results are analysed separately by gender, the new drug outperforms the old treatment in both groups. Men who take the new drug recover more frequently than men who take the old treatment, and women who take the new drug also recover more frequently than women who take the old treatment. And so it seems clear that the new drug is superior, effective for both men and women, better than the alternative, and yet when the data from both groups are combined, when the overall recovery rates are calculated across the entire study population, the old treatment appears to outperform the new drug, showing higher overall recovery rates. And this reversal, where a trend that holds in every subgroup disappears or reverses when the subgroups are combined, is Simpson's paradox, named after the statistician Edward Simpson, who described it formally in 1951, though the phenomenon had been noted earlier by others. And the paradox reveals how aggregating data can mislead, how the whole can tell a different story than the parts, and how statistical reasoning requires careful attention to confounding variables and the structure of causal relationships. The resolution of the paradox lies in understanding that the populations are not balanced, that more men than women take the new drug, or more women than men take the old treatment, or that the recovery rates differ between genders for reasons unrelated to the drugs. And this imbalance means that the overall average is dominated by the group with higher representation. And if men have higher recovery rates in general, and most men take the new drug, then the new drug will appear effective overall, even if it is actually less effective than the old treatment when gender is controlled for. Or if the distribution is skewed in other ways, the opposite reversal can occur. And the paradox shows that crude averages can be misleading. That Simpson's paradox occurs whenever there is a lurking variable, a confounding factor that influences both the treatment assignment and the outcome, and failing to account for this variable leads to incorrect conclusions. Consider a simpler example involving college admissions. Suppose a university has two departments, and Department A admits 70% of applicants, while Department B admits 30%. And when applications are examined by gender, it appears that the university discriminates against women, because the overall acceptance rate for women is lower than for men. But when the data are broken down by department, a different picture emerges. In Department A, which is less selective, a higher percentage of female applicants are admitted than male applicants, and in Department B, which is more selective, the same is true. Women are admitted at higher rates than men in both departments, and the overall appearance of discrimination arises because more women apply to Department B, which has a lower acceptance rate, while more men apply to Department A, which has a higher acceptance rate. And so even though women are favoured in both departments, they appear disfavoured overall. And this is Simpson's paradox. The confounding variable is the choice of department, which correlates with both gender and acceptance rate. And ignoring this variable produces a misleading aggregate statistic. The paradox has profound implications for how we interpret statistical data, for medical research where treatment effects can appear or disappear depending on how data are aggregated, for social science where trends in subgroups can reverse when combined. For legal cases where evidence of discrimination or bias can seem to vanish or appear depending on how populations are divided, and the paradox shows that there is no neutral or objective way to report statistics, that the choice of whether to aggregate or disaggregate, whether to control for certain variables or not, is a substantive decision that affects what conclusions can be drawn, and this decision should be guided by causal understanding, by knowledge of which variables are confounders and which are mediators, and this knowledge cannot be derived from the statistics alone, but requires background theory, domain expertise, and careful thinking about causal structure. Simpson's paradox also raises questions about the nature of causation and the relationship between correlation and causation, because the paradox shows that correlations can reverse when additional variables are considered, that associations in data are sensitive to what is held constant and what is allowed to vary, and this means that identifying causal relationships from observational data is more difficult than it might seem, that confounders must be identified and controlled for, that causal inference requires not just statistical analysis but causal modelling, the specification of hypotheses about how variables influence each other, and the paradox is one reason why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for establishing causation, because randomization ensures that treatment assignment is independent of confounding variables, breaking the associations that generate Simpson's paradox. The paradox appears in many real-world contexts. In sports statistics, where a player can have a better batting average than another player in every season, yet a worse average over their entire career, because they played different numbers of games in different seasons. In economic data where wages can increase for every demographic group, yet average wages can decrease overall, because the composition of the workforce shifts toward lower wage groups. In epidemiology, where a treatment can appear harmful overall, yet beneficial in every subgroup, because sicker patients are more likely to receive the treatment, and in each case the paradox reveals the danger of naive data interpretation, the risk of drawing conclusions from aggregate statistics without understanding the underlying structure. Some philosophers and statisticians argue that Simpson's paradox is not really a paradox, but a reminder of the importance of causal thinking, that the appearance of paradox arises only when we treat statistical associations as if they were causal relationships, that once we distinguish between correlation and causation, between conditional independence and causal independence, the paradox dissolves, and the correct answer to whether the new drug is better than the old treatment depends on the causal structure, on whether gender is a confounder that should be controlled for or a mediator that should not be, and this depends on the mechanisms by which the drugs work and the reasons why gender affects recovery rates. Simpson's paradox has also been used to critique certain statistical practices, to question the use of aggregate statistics in policymaking, to highlight the need for transparent reporting of how data are broken down and what variables are controlled for, and to emphasize that statistical analysis is not a neutral technical exercise, but involves interpretive choices that reflect background assumptions and values, and different choices can support different conclusions, even from the same data. And this does not mean that statistics are arbitrary or that all interpretations are equally valid, but it does mean that statistical reasoning requires judgment, requires thinking about causal mechanisms, requires transparency about methods, and requires humility about the limits of what data alone can tell us. The data sit in tables, broken down by subgroups, aggregated across populations, and the numbers tell different stories depending on how they are arranged. And Simpson's paradox reminds us that statistics are not self-interpreting, that averages can mislead, that trends can reverse, and that understanding data requires more than calculation, requires causal reasoning, domain knowledge, and careful attention to structure. and the paradox persists as a warning. A puzzle that appears in textbook examples and real-world disasters, a reminder that numbers lie, or rather, that we lie to ourselves when we treat numbers as transparent windows onto reality rather than as constructed representations that must be interpreted with care. And the reversal of trends continues to surprise, continues to catch analysts off guard, continues to generate misleading headlines and faulty policies. And Simpson's paradox endures, not because the mathematics is obscure, but because the temptation to aggregate, to simplify, to collapse complex data into simple averages is overwhelming, and the paradox stands as a permanent challenge to that temptation. A proof that simplification can distort, that the whole is not always the sum of the parts, and that statistical reasoning, done properly, requires vigilance, sophistication, and an understanding of causation that transcends mere correlation. The repugnant conclusion, why creating billions of barely happy people seems better. A utilitarian philosopher sits with a calculator, attempting to determine which world is best, which future humanity should aim for, and the principle guiding the calculation is simple. Maximize total happiness, create the most good, ensure that the sum of well-being across all people is as large as possible. And this seems like a reasonable goal, seems like an obviously good principle. Who could argue against making the world contain more happiness rather than less? And yet when this principle is applied consistently, when the logic is followed to its conclusion, the result is deeply counterintuitive, deeply troubling. And this troubling result is called the repugnant conclusion, first articulated by philosopher Derek Parfit. And it says that for any world containing a population of people living excellent lives, lives of great happiness and fulfillment, there exists a better world, according to utilitarian calculation, containing a much larger population, living lives barely worth living, lives that contain only slightly more happiness than suffering. And the second world is better, because even though each person is much less happy, the total amount of happiness is greater due to the vastly larger population. And this conclusion seems repugnant, seems to violate our intuitions about what makes a world good, and yet it follows logically from the principle of maximizing total happiness. Imagine World A, containing 1 billion people, and each person lives a wonderful life, a life filled with love, and beauty, and meaning, and joy, a life worth living many times over. And the total happiness in this world is enormous. And now imagine World Z, containing 1 trillion people, and each person's life is barely worth living, contains just slightly more pleasure than pain, just enough satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence, but not much more. No deep relationships, no profound experiences, just a thin layer of positive feeling spread across a vast multitude. And when we calculate total happiness, World Z wins, because even though each person is much less happy, there are so many more people that the total sum is greater. 1 trillion barely positive lives sum to more total happiness than 1 billion excellent lives. And according to the utilitarian principle that says we should maximize total happiness, World Z is better than World A. We should prefer it, should work to bring it about. And this seems absurd, seems like a reduction to absurdity of the maximizing principle, and yet the logic is impeccable, follows directly from the idea that goodness is total happiness. Visualize the choice as a graph. On one axis is population size, on the other axis is average happiness per person, and World A has high average happiness and moderate population, and World Z has very low average happiness but enormous population, and the area under the curve represents total happiness, and World Z has more area, more total happiness, despite having much lower average happiness. And the repugnant conclusion says we should prefer the world with more area, more total happiness, even though this means accepting a vast population of people whose lives are barely worth living. And this seems to violate basic intuitions about human dignity, about quality of life, about what it means to create a good world. Because most people would rather live in World A, would rather be one of the 1 billion living excellent lives than one of the 1 trillion living barely positive lives. And a theory that says World Z is better seems to have gone wrong somewhere. Parfit called the conclusion repugnant because it seems to endorse a world that intuitively seems worse, seems to recommend creating vast populations, living lives of minimal quality, and this conflicts with our sense that what matters is not just total happiness, but how that happiness is distributed. How good each person's life is, whether lives are worth living in a robust sense, rather than barely scraping by. And the paradox forces a choice: either accept the repugnant conclusion and bite the bullet, admitting that yes, World Z really is better, and our intuitions are wrong, or reject total utilitarianism, reject the principle that all that matters is total happiness, and adopt some alternative that avoids the conclusion. But every alternative has costs, has its own counterintuitive implications. One response is to adopt average utilitarianism, which says what matters is not total happiness, but average happiness per person. And by this measure, World A is clearly better than World Z, because the average person in World A is much happier, and the repugnant conclusion is avoided. But average utilitarianism has its own problems. It implies that we can improve the world by killing unhappy people, because removing people whose happiness is below average raises the average. And this seems even more repugnant than the original conclusion. An average utilitarianism also implies that a world with one extremely happy person is better than a world with 1 billion moderately happy people, as long as the single person's happiness exceeds the average of the billion. And this seems wrong, seems to sacrifice too much for the sake of avoiding one counterintuitive conclusion. Another response is to adopt variable value principles, where the marginal value of adding a person depends on the quality of their life. Creating people with excellent lives adds more value per person than creating people with barely positive lives. And this can avoid the repugnant conclusion by making World A better than World Z, despite having fewer people, because the excellent lives contribute more value per person. But this approach requires specifying how the marginal value changes, requires drawing lines about which lives add how much value. And these lines seem arbitrary, and the approach faces technical difficulties, can generate cycles where A is better than B is better than C, and C is better than A, creating intransitive preferences that undermine rational choice. A third response is to reject consequentialism entirely, to argue that what matters is not just outcomes, not just how much happiness exists, but also rights, dignity, fairness. And these values are not captured by summing happiness and creating a world of 1 trillion people. Living barely worthwhile lives might maximize total happiness, but violates something important about human dignity, about what it means to respect persons. And this deontological response avoids the repugnant conclusion by appealing to values beyond happiness. But it must explain what these values are, how they are weighed against happiness, and whether they really should override considerations of total welfare. The repugnant conclusion also raises practical questions about population ethics, about how many people should exist, about whether we have obligations to create future people, and if so, what quality of life they should have. And these questions are not academic. They affect policy decisions about climate change, resource allocation, family planning, and sustainability. Because if creating more people is good, as long as their lives are worth living, then we should maximize population growth up to the point where additional people would lower everyone's quality of life below the barely worth living threshold. And this seems to recommend creating enormous populations living in poverty, which seems wrong. And if instead we think population should be limited to ensure high quality of life for each person, then we are rejecting total utilitarianism in favour of some other principle, and we need to say what that principle is and why it is right. Parfit himself was troubled by the repugnant conclusion, spent decades trying to find a population ethic that avoided it while remaining plausible, and he proposed various principles, but none fully satisfied him, and he concluded that population ethics is one of the hardest problems in moral philosophy, a domain where all theories seem to have deeply counterintuitive implications, and perhaps there is no fully satisfactory answer, no principle that aligns with all our intuitions, and we must choose which intuitions to preserve and which to sacrifice. And this choosing is itself a moral judgment, requires deciding what values are most important, and different people will make different choices based on different weights. They give to total happiness versus average happiness versus rights versus dignity. The calculator sits on the desk. The numbers are clear. World Z has more total happiness than World A. The calculation is not in doubt. And yet something rebels, something in us rejects the conclusion, insists that World A is better, that a world of 1 billion excellent lives is preferable to a world of 1 trillion barely positive lives, even if the total sum of happiness is less. And this rebellion reveals that our values are more complex than simple maximization, that we care about distribution, about quality, about more than just the sum, and the repugnant conclusion stands as a challenge to utilitarianism, as a reductio ad absurdum that forces reconsideration of the maximizing principle, and Parfit's legacy includes this unsolved problem, this paradox that shows the difficulty of systematizing our moral intuitions, the challenge of finding principles that match our judgments, and the repugnant conclusion remains, repugnant and unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of consequentialist ethics. A reminder that maximizing happiness may not be as simple or as obviously right as it first appears. The split brain paradox. When one person becomes two, a patient suffers from severe epilepsy, seizures that cannot be controlled by medication, seizures that spread across the brain causing disability and danger, and as a last resort, surgeons perform a procedure called corpus callosotomy, severing the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And this procedure prevents seizures from spreading, confines them to one hemisphere, and after surgery the patient seems normal, speaks and acts as before, personality intact, memories preserved, and casual observation reveals no deficit. But careful testing reveals something extraordinary, something deeply strange. The two hemispheres have been separated, are processing information independently, are operating as two separate cognitive systems. And in certain experimental conditions, the hemispheres appear to have different perceptions, different knowledge, different intentions, and the patient, who was one person with one unified consciousness, before surgery now seems to be two persons, two separate centers of awareness inhabiting a single body, and this is the split brain paradox, a puzzle about personal identity, about the unity of consciousness, about whether consciousness is divisible, and about what counts as a person, and the phenomenon, discovered and studied extensively by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, challenges our assumptions about the self, about the unity of the mind, and about whether consciousness is necessarily singular or could be plural within a single brain. Imagine the split brain setup. The patient sits before a screen and images are flashed briefly to either the left or right visual field, and because of how vision is organized, the left visual field projects to the right hemisphere and the right visual field to the left hemisphere. And normally, the hemispheres communicate through the corpus callosum, sharing information. But in split brain patients, this communication is severed, and information presented to one hemisphere is not available to the other, and the left hemisphere, which controls language, can report what it sees, but the right hemisphere, which typically lacks language, cannot speak. And this creates dissociations, cases where the person can verbally report seeing something flash to the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere, but denies seeing anything flash to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, and yet the right hemisphere clearly saw the stimulus. Because when asked to point with the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient points accurately. And so the patient both saw and did not see, both knows and does not know, depending on which hemisphere is asked. And the unity of consciousness seems to break down, seems to split into two separate streams. The paradox becomes even more dramatic in cases of conflicting intentions, where experimenters present different instructions to each hemisphere, and the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, performs one action while the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, performs another, and sometimes the hands conflict. One hand buttoning a shirt while the other unbuttons it, one hand reaching for an object while the other pushes it away, and the patient reports frustration, reports feeling as if the left hand has a mind of its own, is acting independently, and the verbal left hemisphere confabulates explanations, invents reasons for the left hand's actions, reasons that are false because the left hemisphere does not know what the right hemisphere is doing, does not have access to its intentions. And these cases suggest that split brain patients are not one person, but two persons. Two separate conscious agents inhabiting one body, each with their own perceptions, their own knowledge, their own goals, and the philosophical question is whether this is correct, whether splitting the brain splits the person, whether consciousness is divisible, whether personal identity can survive such division. Visualize consciousness before and after the surgery. Before surgery, there is one unified consciousness, one stream of awareness, experiences from both hemispheres integrated, and after surgery, this unity is broken. Each hemisphere processes information separately, and the question is whether there are now two consciousnesses, two subjects of experience, or whether there is still one consciousness that has become disconnected from some information, and different philosophers give different answers. Some argue that split brain patients become two persons, that severing the corpus callosum creates two centers of consciousness, where there was one, and others argue that the patient remains one person, but with a divided consciousness, a consciousness that is no longer unified. And still others argue that consciousness remains unified, but access to information is divided, and the hemispheres are like modules within one consciousness rather than separate consciousnesses. The split brain paradox raises questions about the relationship between unity and consciousness, about whether consciousness is essentially unified or whether it could be divided or plural. And normal consciousness feels unified, feels like there is one subject experiencing everything, one perspective from which the world is viewed, and split brain cases challenge this unity, suggest that consciousness could be less unified than it seems, could be divided into separate streams that normally communicate but could operate independently. And this has implications for understanding the self, for whether the self is a unified entity or a collection of parts, for whether personal identity requires unity of consciousness or could survive division. One response to the paradox denies that split brain patients become two persons, argues that the left hemisphere, the language-dominant hemisphere, is the person, is the locus of consciousness and self-awareness, and the right hemisphere, while capable of processing information and guiding behavior, lacks the higher-order thought and self-awareness that constitute personhood. And so the patient remains one person, the left hemisphere person, and the right hemisphere is more like an unconscious module that influences behavior without being a separate conscious agent. And this response preserves the singularity of persons, but at the cost of denying consciousness to the right hemisphere. Another response accepts that split brain patients become two persons, accepts that there are two centers of consciousness after surgery, two subjects of experience, and argues that personal identity is not preserved through brain bisection, that splitting the brain creates two persons from one, and these two persons share a body, share a past, but are distinct in the present, have different experiences, different knowledge, and this response takes the split brain evidence seriously, treats the hemispheres as separate conscious systems, but faces the challenge of explaining how two persons can inhabit one body, how they coordinate, and whether one has priority over the other. A third response appeals to degrees of unity, argues that consciousness is not all or nothing unified, but comes in degrees, and split brain patients have less unified consciousness than normal people, but are not completely divided, are somewhere between one person and two, and unity of consciousness is a spectrum, and split brain patients are toward the divided end. And this response avoids the binary choice between one person and two, allows for partial division, for consciousness that is neither fully unified nor fully separate. And this seems to fit the evidence better, fits the fact that split brain patients seem mostly normal, seem like one person most of the time, but show signs of division in specific experimental conditions. The split brain paradox also connects to debates about personal identity over time, about what makes you the same person you were yesterday, about whether personal identity requires psychological continuity, and split brain cases are like thought experiments about fission made real, are actual cases where one person seems to become two, and philosophers have long debated fission cases, cases where a person's brain is divided and placed in two bodies, and asked whether the original person survives, and if so, which resulting person is the original. And split brain surgery is a partial realization of this scenario, does not create two separate bodies, but does create two separate information processing systems, and the philosophical puzzles about fission apply to split brain cases, puzzles about identity, about survival, about what matters in personal existence. The patient lives with split brain, navigates the world, seems normal to observers, and most of the time, the two hemispheres cooperate through shared subcortical structures, through behavioral coordination, through learned patterns, and the division is not apparent. But in the laboratory, under controlled conditions, the split emerges. The two hemispheres reveal their independence, and the paradox appears: one person or two, unified or divided, single consciousness or dual, and the answer remains disputed, remains unclear, and the split brain paradox endures as one of the most fascinating and philosophically significant phenomena in neuroscience, a real-world case that challenges our understanding of consciousness, of unity, of personal identity, and of what it means to be one person rather than many. And the severed corpus callosum sits there, two hemispheres separated, and the question persists: is this one mind or two? And the paradox remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent puzzle about the nature of self and consciousness.